Alright, well now we're going into another Arcane deep dive. This time we're looking at Silco and the monster within. Now, Silco has just lovely lines throughout the entire series, and I think I just want to make some comments about some of the great lines that Silco brings to the table here. And I want to do this bit by bit here. So, first off, let's just look at this entire scene. And this entire scene in itself is just a good comment on both external and internal demons that exist in the world. So let's start off. Here we are.
Beautiful, aren't they? Yet up there on the surface, no one even knows they exist.
And that's kind of an interesting point about life in and of itself, is the fact that underneath the surface, underneath the calm, are these huge creatures here. Now, when you think about that, is like you can look at the situation that's kind of bubbling underneath the surface in the case of, the whole situation with Topside and the Undercity, the whole war that could easily break out, more like a civil war between two parts of the city. And, before that happened, most people would probably think, things would be peaceful, it may not be great, but, things would move on in a normal manner. And then they stop doing that, and things really get out of control because of larger, more powerful forces that want to move them in a different direction. In this case, for example, Silco is kind of the embodiment of that kind of powerful force, or that that huge sea creature that lives underneath the surface, waiting for the moment to pop out. Now, you could look at this in the same way, for example, of just normal events that happen in life. Things that seem peaceful in a certain area, then suddenly certain events happen where what we thought was maybe dangerous, but would not go so far, and then a larger country attacks a smaller country and totally changes the way the order is. Things become more dangerous than they seemed initially. People were unaware that things could radically change so quickly. And that is, of course, from a geopolitical point of view, but even from a normal life point of view, you could feel like you live safe in your own home until someone invades the house, steals your stuff, and you feel very uncomfortable, very unsafe in that situation. And these things happen in life. I mean, you may feel that everything's peaceful and everything's nice until suddenly a creature comes out. And the thing is, as Derek mentions, that
they're monsters.
Yeah, and he mentions there's monsters. And the fact is, the reality is that you need to be aware that these types of creatures exist, and you need to prepare for that reality. Now, what's really interesting here is that up until this point, all we've been really talking about is the outside, creatures that exist out there. But the threats are not always external. And this is something that Silco mentions. And of course, ominous music.
There's a monster inside all of us.
And that is what Silco mentions. There's a monster inside all of us. Now, what's interesting here is that while this just kind of seems to be, typical villainous type of commentary here, the fact of the matter is that this exists as something that is true. Even in people, normal people, is the fact that some sort of dark and violent force exists. It's a question of whether you are aware of it and how you deal with it. And in the case of Ordinary Men, which is just a wonderful book by Christopher All Browning about the police battalion in Poland, is kind of a very sad and tragic story about how perfectly normal people slowly ended up contributing to what was considered the final solution in World War II. And if you think about it, most people, if when they initially think about it, it's like if were you, it would be like, a Nazi guard who was just following orders, or would you be Oscar Schindler? And most people want to think that they would be the good person. But history pretty much tells us that people who are willing to risk to do those really brave deeds are very few and far between. Now, that is, of course, one sort of side here. And the fact of the matter is that even Jung pretty much goes off and says that, man is on the whole less good than he imagines himself wants to be. And Silco's pretty much nailed that on the head there, in that, inside of us, there is kind of a darkness that exists. Now, Arcane of itself actually does a fairly decent job of kind of telling that story a little bit. When we think about it, for example, from the point of view of Powder, when we look at her, she seems to be kind of sad. She has maybe a little slight issue as far as abandonment is concerned, up until about episode 3. That becomes fairly obvious. But there's also, when you look at episode 1, there are some warning signs up there about kind of the idea that Powder has some very dangerous elements to her that she is not aware of yet. She's too young, so she can't quite possibly think all these things through. For example, she creates a mechanical device that she puts nails in them, and then she takes that device and she throws it at a kid that is chasing her. Now, of course, you could look at this as strictly self-defense, but the thing is, if that thing were to blow up, the amount of shrapnel that would result would completely mutilate and most likely kill the person who is trying to assault her and take her stuff. Now, is that kind of an appropriate reaction to what could happen? Again, you don't know. You don't know if the guy's going to kill her or not. But it seems to be a very hideous type of device to create and to use, but she is not kind of aware of that. It's like, you look at this, and because of the very harsh nature of the world, there's a lot of dark elements in it, and someone growing up in that just is not kind of aware of the kind of base violence that exists. It's kind of there. And as you move on through the series, and of course there's a whole lot of tragic events that happened, the fact of the matter is that Jinx and Powder not able to successfully integrate the dark side of her character. Basically, she ends up just kind of going and killing probably about 30-ish people in the entire series. I mean, has the highest body count of anybody in the show. So this is kind of one side. It's a very extreme side, but it's kind of a side that shows exactly how monstrous certain characters can become when in the very beginning they seem to be, sort of reasonable type of characters. But then there's another side to this. When we actually look at the whole fight with Vi Jace at the Shimmer power plant, you actually see a case where Jace kind of goes off a little bit. I mean, he's going off and he's shooting, all the bad guys, and the scene is really, really cool. But the fact of the matter is that in the end, he basically shoots a kid by accident. And this is kind of, in a way, letting the monster that lived inside him get out and go a step too far. He saw the consequence of that and then immediately pulled back. And that resulted in Jace having to parlay for peace. He saw the darkness that existed and was facilitated by Hextech. He saw that, of course, the counselors in Piltover did not care. The darkness that exists there is like, if the monster that exists within Piltover is fully leashed and goes out and attacks Zahn, it would be a catastrophe for the city. You don't want something like that to actually come out. And this is something that, at least from Silco's point of view, is like, but these things exist, and it's okay for the monster to come out. And from my point of view, you could look at this as maybe just maybe the fight between Zahn and Piltover would not be as completely as one-sided as Jace would think them to be, because I can imagine, using the full power of Shimmer and creating, more Shimmer mutants besides, the attacks at the factory would indicate. I mean, it could get worse. I mean, Silco could of course, spread out Shimmer to the top side, create larger, instances of addiction and just mayhem. But again, it would be really, really, really bad. The whole darkness and whole of the entire civil war that would brought up would be just extremely horrible for both sides. And that comes down to the question of whether both sides can successfully deal with the darkness and the violence that exists within, not only within the people themselves, but within the over city itself. And I think in Arcane itself, it's really important to not only to realize that this exists, because obviously if you don't realize it exists, you can't control it, you can't deal with it. But by seeing that you've taken a step too far, well, hopefully you never get that far, but by seeing that it exists and then properly dealing with it, you can move forward. And you can, of course, act in a position of both strength and goodness. And I think that's extremely important point that is actually being made in this series, if you look out for it. And it's stuff like this that Silco mentions from time to time in episode from episode that really, if you were paying attention, can set up a very fascinating conversation and discussion. And so I just wanted to point that out in what would seem to be like just a few seconds of dialogue that is just kind of really, really deep if you really think about it. And I'll see you in the next episode. So bye-bye.